Very good morning, everyone. Thank you again, JP Morgan and Asia Society, for organizing this event. It's very much a pleasure to be here and to be sharing the stage with three city and sort of regional development experts. My name is Trisha Suresh. I'll do a quick round of introductions. I work for the Economist Intelligence Unit, and 2 years ago, we developed a city competitiveness index, of which I was a co-editor. We looked at 120 cities. We looked at different facets of competitiveness and sort of ranked cities, not just Asian cities, global cities. Hong Kong came number 4 out of 120 cities, so we're in the 4th most competitive city in the world. Singapore was 3rd, which was the most competitive Asian city. I am from Singapore, so I just relocated to Hong Kong, which is quite exciting as well. And so I've got 2 feet now, one in the most competitive city and maybe in the 2nd most competitive city. I'll go through a round of introductions of the rest of the panelists. We've got Michael Enright here, who is the Sun Hung Kai Properties Professor. He's a leading expert in competitiveness, regional development, with a focus on Asia Pacific. He directs Asia Pacific Competitiveness Program at the Hong Kong Institute of Economics and Business Strategy. He's also the founding partner and advisory board member of the Competitiveness Institute. Michael has consulted for companies, governments, MNCs on strategy and city-related development. Thank you, Michael, for being here. We've also got Professor Soon Bae Kim. He is a professor of economics at the National University of Singapore Business School. He was previously a chief economist at Goldman Sachs in Hong Kong, and he was also an economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. Professor Kim is a market-savvy economist. He's got experience both in Singapore and Hong Kong, and again will be very helpful in today's discussions. Finally, but definitely not the least, we've got Greg Clark, who is a global fellow at the Metropolitan Program and Global Cities Initiative at the Brookings Institution. He's a global advisor on city and regional development. He's worked with the OECD. He has been a development advisor for many global cities, including London and New York. He has authored over 10 books and numerous reports around city and urban development. So that's very briefly our panelists for today. I'm quite excited to get this conversation going, sort of going on with more of this preamble. So we're talking about today's panel is around competitiveness of cities. We'll be looking very broadly at Asian cities, what's driving competitiveness in this region, what are the risks to competitiveness in Asian cities, how do they maintain this, and also maybe comparing it to some of the other global cities in the world. So I'll just very quickly go through, very quick preamble, really. So global trade and power has always been between countries, but increasingly global business is looking at cities. So cities are very important. And the work that we do at the EIU is also very focused on cities. We get companies coming to us all the time asking us not just which countries to enter, but which cities to enter, and which are the competitive cities that they should be entering. So fast economic growth of Asian cities, with fast economic growth of Asian cities, there is real fierce competition between cities to attract both capital and talent. So this conversation today is quite an interesting one. So before we sort of delve into where the most competitive cities are, what's driving this competitiveness, let's just maybe very quickly define what exactly is competitiveness. I think all of us will agree that it's more than just economic growth. So we talked about this very briefly before this panel started. We can probably talk for a few hours about what the different facets of competitiveness are. But maybe we can have Michael, who can maybe start us off with very broadly what we should be thinking of when we think of competitiveness in cities, and then also where are some of the most competitive cities in the world and what's driving this competitiveness.
Looking at competitiveness these days is a very interesting phenomenon. In terms of definitions, there are 3 schools of thought. The first one, is reminiscent of Michael Porter's definition back in his 1990 book, Competitive Advantage of Nations, where he said competitiveness is the ability of a nation, region, or city to have a high and rising standard of living for its people. Then there are a whole bunch of other people who take what might be the Judge Stevens approach, where they can't define competitiveness, but they say they know what it is when they see it. The trouble with both of those approaches is that they become a Rorschach test. So you get people sitting in places like Geneva and other places, trying to tell the world what constitutes competitiveness. The leading edge thought today has actually stripped it down to the simplicity. Competitiveness is about productivity. If you talk to Mike Porter today, he says competitiveness, productivity, these terms are almost interchangeable. If you talk to Paul Krugman, he'll say, productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's nearly everything. And when one starts measuring competitiveness, in my view, what you need to do is measure a pure productivity index. And then there are questions about what you do with that. Is the productivity of a nation used to enhance the well-being of its citizens sufficiently? What goes into producing that productivity. But at the end of the road, when companies look for locations to go to, and they've been looking at cities not for the last 5 years, but for the last 500 years, they look at where can we be productive. So to me, everything else is how we get there and what we do with it, but the core is productivity.
And so in Asia, we can probably all agree that maybe Singapore and Hong Kong are some of the most competitive cities. Where else in Asia do we find very competitive cities, and where are cities that are coming up very quickly by way of competitiveness?
Well, the big picture when you look at Asian cities, and if you look at purely productivity, Asian cities are way behind most of the leading cities in Europe and in North America. It's only when you start compiling indices with lots of complicated variables that Asian cities rise in global rankings. I wouldn't put Hong Kong in the world's top 10 cities. I wouldn't put Singapore in the world's top 15 cities. I wouldn't put Beijing or Shanghai in the world's top 30 cities. Because they don't generate the levels of productivity, the levels of innovation, the levels of globally relevant decision-making that we see in the leading cities in North America and in Europe. We do have obvious lead cities in the region. We have lead cities of Hong Kong, Singapore. Those are the two most globally oriented cities. The other cities in Asia that are significant are largely significant because they are the main cities in sizable economies. Tokyo, of course, world's third largest economy, Tokyo, the leading city. Seoul, of course, and again, both places quite innovative. Able to generate companies, organizations with global reach. The other cities around Asia, you basically look at as national centers. You look at a KL as the place where the world meets Malaysia and Malaysia meets the world. You look at Jakarta as the place where, the world meets Indonesia and where Indonesia meets the world. Even if you go further south into Australia, talk about Asia Pacific, Sydney is not a regional center or a global center. Sydney is where the world meets Australia and where Australia meets the rest of the world. So when we look at the other cities in the region, what we tend to see is cities that are dynamic are the ones that have dynamic economies around them and that get the business basics right enough to be able to link those cities to the rest of the region and the rest of the world.
So we talked about productivity being one of the, basically the benchmark for competitiveness. Or Professor Kim, you've talked a little bit about productivity and what's driving productivity in cities. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
I'm glad Michael sort of put his laser focus on productivity because I know very little about cities except maybe by the judge's definition, which city is a great place to live. I was fortunate to live in Hong Kong for nearly 14 years and then moved to the other global city in Asia, which is Singapore, for the last 7. So there's a bit of a first-hand kind of an impression. But let me set the context in the following way. About 25 years ago, there was a young economist called Alwyn Young, and he published a paper entitled A Tale of Two Cities, kind of hearkening back to Charles Dickens's novel. And he compares Hong Kong and Singapore at the time, the two of the four tigers of Asia. And as a true blood sort of, mainstream economist, Alvin Young had a very strong prior, which is Hong Kong is a very laissez-faire place. Government provides some of the basic infrastructures, law and order, but pretty much stays out of everything else. And Singapore is a very much of an interventionist economy. Of course, the key thing is these cities are also the national economy at the time. And the conclusion that he drew was the key factor, productivity growth, was substantially higher in Hong Kong than in Singapore. So it's a question of sort of inspiration versus perspiration. You can think about productivity, technological innovation, efficiency, as squeezing more out of a given set of resources as compared to perspiration, which is working hard, saving a lot, and plowing a lot of that into investment. Okay. So that was, it caused some degree of concern in Singapore. It's a very competitive place in its mindset. I said this because I teach a course in international finance and macro. And I said, well, 25 years later, have things changed? Have things changed between Hong Kong and Singapore? And so I did some background research. And the following emerged. It's kind of a tale of city part two. During the time that I lived in Hong Kong from the early 90s till 2007, Hong Kong actually, despite all the malaise that you sense from the popular press, had an incredible productivity renaissance from a macro point of view, which is the transformation of the economy really into services as the economy got integrated with China, decline of manufacture, the rise of logistics, finance, insurance, other financial services, so on and so forth. And so there's a structural transformation, but the remarkable thing is a productivity level and growth in the economy really surged. Now, people can split hairs about the precise estimate, but the order of magnitude is actually very impressive. What happened in Singapore in the last 10 years is actually quite the opposite story. Compared to the 1980s through, let's say, the mid-1990s, productivity growth in Singapore has actually slowed quite a bit. There's this notion of total factor productivity, which is not just labor capital, but productivity that just boosts the efficiency of uses of both factors of production. And Singapore has had a very substantial slowdown. And so this has raised a big concern in terms of policymakers. So there's a whole sort of soul searching going on in Hong Kong, but I think more so in Singapore. So this raises a question. I don't have the answer. Well, I have an opinion, but not necessarily the final answer in terms of what policy can do about it. But I think that's a very important sort of a lesson to keep in mind. I guess the final thing I would say is we're sort of used to thinking about Hong Kong and Singapore as global financial centers, where financial services play a very critical role. But I think the political economy of both places have evolved and matured to the extent that those who are not in the globalized industries, their voice starting to matter. And the frustrations in terms of asset price inflation, congestion, pollution, all of those things are starting to matter. So I think perhaps some of the metrics that are typically used to look at global competitiveness may sound fine and dandy for the globally mobile workforce, for those who basically have their roots down in Hong Kong or Singapore, who are not part of that global industry. These, I guess, environment has created some frictions and frustrations that increasingly I think is going to be relevant for the policy-making settings in these places. And I think that's another big challenge facing these two cities.
Right. So a lot of it, I guess, in some ways, you get to a certain level of success that we were talking about, Greg, earlier, in terms of competitiveness, and then you find a lot more challenges. So, Greg, maybe you can jump in here with. Professor Kim has talked a little bit about some of the challenges. What are some of the policy levers to either overcome these challenges, or are there any other challenges that cities sort of face as they reach this sort of global competitive city.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. And, well, firstly, thank you to JP Morgan and to the Asia Society for the invitation to be here. I only apologise that I brought the weather with me from London. That didn't really mean to do that, but here it is. Firstly, I would agree with everything that's already been said. I guess the element I would add is that competitiveness also implies some intentional desire on the part of a city to improve its performance and to address itself comparatively and competitively with other cities. Competitiveness is a mindset as well as paying attention to all of those factors of productivity that have been talked about. And my way of thinking about this is that there are, as it were, framework conditions, tax costs, regulation, openness, etc. There are hard factors, infrastructure, land use, etc. There are soft factors, enterprise, skills, innovation. And Peter Scher talked about the importance of skills and labour market productivity, if I can put it that way. The ability of a labour market to properly absorb and utilise the talent that it has is critical to the competitiveness of a city because it's part of its productivity. And then the other point I think we should make is that different cities work to different models. So you can't compare the competitiveness of Hong Kong with the competitiveness of Singapore very easily because these are cities that have very different economic models at their heart. They're playing different kinds of roles with a different offer using a different platform. These are actually very complementary cities rather than competitive cities. And there's a whole school of thought that actually improving overall global competitiveness of a city is also about complementing and cooperating with others. We did a piece of work within the Global Cities Initiative called The 10 Traits of Global Fluency. I'm not going to give you a 1-hour lecture on it, but I hope you'll enjoy reading it. And we tried to identify many of these factors of productivity and this competitive mindset, looking at the dynamics of globalization as the new feature, which Michael talked about, and we set out some thoughts in that report. And the work we've been doing in Hong Kong is to look at Hong Kong from that point of view. But let me now come to your question. For most of the cities that I work with, the highly globalized or globalizing cities, productivity is also driven by agglomeration economics. And the problem that arises over time is that productivity becomes eroded by externalities, the unintended consequences of being competitive, which are infrastructure stress, bifurcation in the labour market, increasing inequality, housing supply challenges, erosion of the quality of public space, absence sometimes of social cohesion, particularly if you've had a high level of globalization in terms of immigration and the diversification of the labor force, the inability of governance systems to adjust to the changing geography of a growing city, so that the geography of the growing city transcends beyond the borders where the governmental institutions are really able to achieve coordination and policy focus. So all of those things then become the challenge. Remaining competitive, if you like, is about tackling the unintended consequences of being competitive. And that's where the Londons and the New Yorks are these days. Most of what they have to do is make sure they don't do things which make them uncompetitive. So both of them are faced with challenges around costs, and they're faced with challenges around maintaining openness to global talent, for example. They both have visa and immigration frameworks which are not conducive to being a successful global city. But for most of them, it's about building infrastructure and modernizing infrastructure. It's about tackling housing problems, and it's about achieving some level of solidarity between those well-established middle-income populations who own their own homes and want to protect their private notions of livability versus being open to the newcomers who are the lifeblood of the city and want to have access to jobs, access to houses, access to skills. So those sorts of issues are critical. And if you look at what the city leaders in the Londons and the New Yorks and the Parises are trying to do, it's about a new deal with their existing citizens to keep the city open, keep it flexible, add to the housing supply, improve the quality of the schools so that they can go into another cycle of being competitive again.
I don't think it's just Londons and New Yorks that are sort of going through some of this.
No, but I use those examples as two of the top cities in the world. And what I'm trying to say is, once you become very successful, like those cities are, you must deal with these challenges.
I think I come from Singapore, and that's in the news every day, housing challenges, a lot of pressures that the government is facing with regards to transport, infrastructure, and keeping all that up. I want to talk a little bit more about, I like this comparison between Singapore and Hong Kong, but I also want to maybe tackle this issue about Singapore's competitiveness vis-a-vis other cities in Southeast Asia, for example, and Hong Kong's competitiveness in relation to some of these Chinese cities. I know that there's a lot of talk already in Singapore about KL perhaps encroaching upon some of Singapore's competitiveness, or if Jakarta cleans its act up, it could be a lot more attractive for businesses, just as Shanghai, maybe Beijing are perhaps attractive as well in some way over Hong Kong. Do you have any thoughts, maybe, Michael, about that encroaching upon competitiveness of some of these established competitive cities?
Well, again, if you look in detail, and I have as well, one base in Hong Kong, one base in Singapore, and I've been working on competitiveness issues in both places since about 1986. What's quite clear is that at the core, Singapore and Hong Kong have been enormously successful. Their paths have almost tracked for the last 30, 40 years in terms of their success. But they're successful because they get the business basics right. That's, the underlying framework, the legal system, the free flow of goods, capital, et cetera, clear rules of the game, the core infrastructure. They get the business basics right, and they are much better than their surrounding cities in those business basics and in their ability to connect globally. So the two of those cities don't, as I said before, if you look at any measure of knowledge intensity, knowledge creation, what we might call the higher order competitiveness features, they don't match up with the world's best. And so the key to their future is doing two things. Number one is it's staying ahead of the other cities in their regions. Well, it's three things. It's staying ahead of the other cities in their regions in terms of their international connectivity, in terms of their skills, their capabilities, what Greg would call their global fluency. It's a matter of enhancing their interaction with the other cities in their neighborhoods, because it's not a zero-sum game. But then the third thing is that they have to become much more the knowledge creators, the knowledge makers, rather than the knowledge takers. At a dinner last night, I used the analogy in both Singapore and Hong Kong, they're more like the moon than the sun. If you look at the global economy, they reflect light, they don't generate light. Both of them have to become light generators if they're really going to rise to the first tier of cities to be on a same footing with a London or New York.
What's going to make them rise to that light creators?
A few things. Number one is pressure. And there is more competitive pressure today. Why do people, there was a time back in the 80s when people were talking about competitiveness a lot, and then it sort of went away for a while. And now, why is everybody talking about competitiveness? Because world markets are tougher. With the global financial crisis, its aftermath, world markets are tighter. Everybody is trying to export their way out. Everybody is trying to become more international, to project more internationally. So the competition is there. So in one part, it's competition is going to push them. But the other is they have to have the capabilities. They have to have the workforce that can generate the knowledge, that can generate innovative solutions to their own problems. There's a need to be more self-reliant. In places like Hong Kong and Singapore, you get the opposite of the not invented here syndrome. If it's invented here, we don't respect it, right? Which is the opposite of what it should be. We need to be more confident, because the ideas that are going to solve Hong Kong's problems are going to solve Singapore's problems. We can certainly learn from the best global cities, and we should. But at the core, those are going to come from a Hong Kong, from a Singapore. So it's a combination: having the basics right, having the infrastructure, having the connectivity, generating the knowledge, using competition as a constructive force to force us to stay ahead. In many ways, I always say, if Hong Kong didn't have the cities of China there to push them, Hong Kong should try to invent them. If Singapore didn't have the other cities of Southeast Asia pushing it, it should try to invent them, because that's what creates the impetus to change.
Right. And where are some of these cities that are very quickly growing and very quickly becoming competitive? So we've talked a lot about Singapore and Hong Kong now, but what about those other smaller cities that are perhaps coming onto the radar and could be, in some ways, pushing these two cities to either up their game? Maybe Greg or Sunbei?
I think my personal view is Hong Kong and Singapore, to a very large extent, are accidents of history. There are sort of cities that started as entrepot colonies, inheriting the common law from the British Empire, facilities with use of English, and freedom to truck and barter, nestling at the edge of much larger economies that were much less developed and controlled. These were tremendous advantages bestowed by historical accidents to have, and I think to Hong Kong and Singapore's credit, they capitalized on it. They didn't just sit on it, they capitalized on it. But I think if you kind of look at the grand sweep of history, that initial competitive advantage is not unassailable. It's not guaranteed. So if you look at the broad sweep of history in Europe, you had the first financial centers, let's say, in Italy, Genoa, Venice, and so forth, Florence, of course, which migrates to Northern Europe because of the rise of the textile industry in Flanders, Bruges, Antwerp, subsequently migrating to London. And more recently, you can think about the history of financial centers in the United States. Philadelphia was the preeminent financial center in the United States before the rise of the textile industry, the first major industrial enterprises in the U.S., which shifted the financial center from Philadelphia to Boston because the financiers in Philadelphia could not keep up with the demands of these structural changes in their economy. Of course, New York's rise to financial preeminence does not happen until about the mid-19th century with the rise of railroads. Boston could no longer accommodate the tremendous capital demand of the railroad industry. Of course, the pinnacle of that era is J.P. Morgan, the namesake of the sponsor or co-sponsor of this conference. So even within a given country, nobody has an unassailable dominance is a financial center. And I think from a Singapore point of view, I think the leadership are very painfully aware of that. They have a tremendous position right now. But if you look at the history, especially from a point of view of city-state, their half-life is actually very short. This is something that the founder of Singapore, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, is painfully aware. If you read his biography, he's painfully aware that these glorious city-states, all basically got eclipsed. This is one of the reasons why Singapore wanted to bulk up and build up a critical mass. I say this as a long-winded preamble because when I was living here, There was a lot of talk about Hong Kong being eclipsed by Shanghai. I think the competitive edge in Hong Kong, broadly defined, is still very, very large. But if I was to make a bold prediction, 50 years out, I think you would be swimming against the tide to basically bet against the rise of many of these Chinese cities as rising to the challenge. And the reason is because the demand is there. It's a simple fact. So it's, I think it's going to be very, very, I think, a big mistake to rest on its laurels. You have to continue to reinvent. Hong Kong's role will not vanish, but it's going to have to reinvent itself. And so finance follows the real economy and, of course, go east. Go east meaning that for the foreseeable generation, the most dynamic, rapidly growing, and hence the most demand-intensive sort of centers of economic growth is presumably going to be in this region. And that's going to put a demand on many of the Chinese cities, in my view, to fill that.
This is not an easy question to answer, Tricia, the one you've asked, because there are different versions of the map depending on what your geography is. But, when I look at Asia from my desk in London, I see 6 cities that are really established as the leaders in Asia. But I think, as Michael has argued very well, they all have different versions of a productivity challenge, particularly around the knowledge creation innovation nexus. But those 6 cities are obviously Hong Kong, Singapore, Tokyo, and then there's Seoul, Beijing, and Shanghai. Question mark, Sydney, depending upon your view of what's Asia, and also depending upon, the point that Michael made is absolutely true, that at least 4 of those cities are simply the biggest city in a growing national economy. But as the dynamics of industrialization, population growth, and urbanization in Asia continue, then we start to see a kind of next tier of Asian cities. So this is what you were asking about. Shenzhen, Bangalore, Guangzhou, Busan, Dalian, Osaka, Chengdu, Pune, Wuhan, Nanjing. You know these cities. And they're all in their own way building a platform of becoming bigger cities, growing, industrializing rapidly, increasingly trying to put to use knowledge creation capability and trying to build some of the productivity we've been talking about. And some of them are also becoming competitive in the sense that they're addressing their identity and their visibility. They're addressing their governance challenges that we talked about. They're trying to be open and connected and trying to achieve some global reach. And it's that group of cities, I think, that's very interesting. And maybe in the conversation in a few minutes, we'll talk about how the world is responding, because actually it places challenges upon other cities around the world. We'll come back to that. But I think it's also important to remember that there's a large group of Asian cities for whom, there should be a lot of anxiety, it seems to me. I'm worried about Mumbai, and I have been for some time. Partly because I think the competitive challenge from Dubai and Abu Dhabi has really undermined Mumbai's position as the emerging global city of India. I'm worried about Delhi and the ability there to really deal with the problems that they have. I'm pretty uncertain about Kuala Lumpur and whether it really has a program of activity that is designed to position it correctly, and how open is it really. Jakarta, Bangkok, both cities where the population is rising, industrialization is taking place, but huge challenges that governance machinery does not seem to be equipped to deal with. And you could raise question marks about Taipei. So let's remember that there's a huge group of Asian cities for whom there's a big set of issues, and we should be thinking about them as well.
I was coming to those questions as well. But the point that you raised as well about how cities outside of Asia are responding to some of these cities, both the established global cities, both established competitive cities, as well as other cities that are fast rising. How are cities outside of Asia responding to this?
Shall I comment on that? Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting. So if you work as I work in Europe and North America and Latin America and Africa, everybody's looking at Asia. Everybody's talking about these amazing Asian cities that are coming out of the ground. Everybody's preoccupied by them. And let's talk about three groups of other global cities. So for the established world cities, London, New York, Paris, Chicago, all of them, this has really reminded them that they can't compete on the basis of sheer scale and numbers anymore. So for London and New York, remaining huge economies, it's not simply a case of we're going to continue to be the biggest, most dominant cities in the global economy. They know they're not. They know that a re-emergent Tokyo or a successful Shanghai will be bigger than them. So it's placed much more emphasis in those cities on quality of life, livability. And you will see, if you read the stories from New York and London and Paris, it's all about, we've achieved competitiveness, now we must achieve livability. So a very strong focus there on everything from transport systems to tackling this housing crisis I talked about, to simple things like public space, beautification, all of that stuff. So you'll see that. Then there's a second group of cities we might look at, which are the other big emerging world cities. We're talking about the Sao Paulos, the Johannesburgs. We're talking about, Moscow, Istanbul. For them, Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore represent a sort of model that they want to pursue. And what I would call it is, an investment-led model. For each of those cities, the challenge has been that urbanization and population growth took place at a time when they were ill-equipped to invest in the infrastructure that they needed to deal with it. The model that's being pursued in China, particularly Shanghai and Beijing, is a kind of inspiration to them that a national government can look at a set of cities and say, actually, we're going to have a model here that's investment-led, we're going to build the hard infrastructure, and then we'll move on to dealing with the soft things. So in those cities, that's quite an inspiration. Then I'd look at a third group and say there's a kind of a group of competitive middleweight cities. These are the middle-sized cities in Europe and North America for whom the old ideas about economic success have been not quite chucked out the window, but have been severely challenged by the shift of the global economic center of gravity east. So if you're Manchester or you're Barcelona, or if you're Seattle, or if you're, Miami, the issue for you then is, how do we become a medium-sized global city that serves the huge growing markets in Asia? And so it comes back to something that Michael was saying earlier. For many of these cities, it's about how do we serve the Asian customer? And that comes down to higher education, international higher education. How do we attract students from Asia? How do we build a tourism offer that brings people from Asia here? How do we, in our healthcare services, provide things that people want? How do we form partnerships that are productive between our firms and larger customer firms in those cities? And so there's a very strong, I think, new era of partnership with Asia emerging that's around serving these big new urban centers from smaller urban centers in Europe and North America that want to have unique relationships with them. And you probably see this happening everywhere.
Are they just afraid as well of Singapore, Hong Kong, Tokyo, Shanghai sort of taking more of that pie?
The word confidence has been used a few times around this room, and it's very important for Hong Kong and Singapore to be confident about what they're good at, to be aware of competition, but to use competition, as Michael said, to drive their own innovation. I think London and New York and Paris feel that. I think there is confidence there. I think, yes, they're aware of this competitive threat. We talk a lot in London about, when's the next multinational going to move to Hong Kong and what does that mean for London? But underlying that, there's a very deep reservoir of psychological self-confidence, which is about the ability to adapt and to enjoy competition. So I think that this is not perceived, at least in my mind, as a threat. It's perceived as an opportunity, but it's one that requires some strategy.
If we come back to Asia, and if we come back to some of the key cities that are of concern in Asia, we talked about some of them. Greg, you mentioned some of the second-tier, third-tier cities. Michael, do you have anything else to add to that in terms of other cities in Asia that are cause for concern, maybe thinking about regional development and regional competitiveness, really?
Sure. Well, if you look globally, there'll be, I don't know, you pick the year, but in the not too distant future, there'll be, again, 1 billion more urban dwellers in Asia than there are today. And this creates challenges across the board. I mean, how do you house the people? How do you provide the infrastructure? How do you provide the basic services to deal with that? Again, according to the Asian Development Bank, over the last 10 years, we've added, I forget the number, but it's several 100 million slum dwellers to urban Asia. So just because we get urbanization, which on average actually makes people accessible as consumers and producers, and in many cases takes them out of subsistence level agriculture. So that means there's a potential for that to be a good thing. Of course, if they wind up living in squalor without education services, public services, healthcare, that's a big deal. China probably is more effective in dealing with these issues than any of the other developing countries in Asia for a few reasons. China, because of the way land ownership works, because of strong central leadership, is able to go in and redevelop cities. And in fact, because of the latent demand, right? Those of you who have been around Chinese cities know that until the reform period, again, Star Trek fans, landing in a Chinese city was like landing on the Borg ship. Every place looked exactly the same. There were no differentiated city centers. There are exceptions, but for the large part, it all looked the same. You didn't have differentiated, high-functioning central business districts. You didn't have what we in the West would call modern urban structures. And the act, because of the sort of latent demand in China, the act of ripping apart an existing Chinese city and redeveloping it with a modern urban structure, actually, if you do it right and you time it right, it pays for itself. It pays in enhanced economic activity for the infrastructure to compensate the people that are displaced, for the utilities, and for developers to go in and develop, to make a bit of money, and for there to be an appreciating asset. In much of the rest of Asia, you have neither the legal structures, the governmental structures, or the social structures that allow that redevelopment to happen. So you either wind up with satellite cities around traditional cities, or you wind up with urban sprawl. Now, this to me is not, I mean, you don't even need to call this a competitiveness issue. This is just a core issue of urbanization. Again, subsistence agriculture is no longer going to be subsistence agriculture. If people are going to be moving to cities, we have to deal with the underlying infrastructure, the underlying social services. And there, I would say that what's going on in China can be a model. But in other places, it can be very difficult to organize the government, the financing, the private sector to carry that out. And in general, that to me is actually the biggest challenge that Asian cities face, is this challenge of dealing with urbanization in creative ways. And in that regard, the problems that Hong Kong and Singapore have are minor in comparison to many of these other cities.
I guess in many ways, Hong Kong and Singapore are just small cities, states, or, well, Singapore is a nation state, but just small cities, easy to manage. And then we have these mega cities that are coming out in both China as well as India. Where does size fit into how competitive cities are? Maybe Michael or Greg?
Well, again, size is an interesting issue. Hong Kong's about 1,000 square kilometers. London's about, 850. New York's about 900. Shanghai is nearly 9,000. Beijing is about 12,500. Chengdu is 13,000. So you have to recognize, first off, when you look at cities, Chongqing is called a municipality in China. It's 80,000 square kilometers. It's a small province. It's not a big city.
Small country.
Yeah. So you have to realize that when you use the term city, city means different things. If you go to Shanghai, what would be called a city in the U.S. is sort of 6 core districts, right? Which house about 7 million people, not that different from New York. You go the 8,800 square kilometers, you've got 20 million people. So first off, when you think about size, you have to think about what that means. Are we talking about apples and oranges? And we are. We're talking about different things when we talk about the municipal level of administrative jurisdiction around the region. But that also entails different types of challenges. What it means is that a mayor or a party secretary in China has responsibility not just for a central business district, but for the core manufacturing suburbs, plus a substantial rural hinterland. And this has certain advantages. It has an advantage that there are individuals who are responsible for thinking about the integrated development of a city and its hinterland. The disadvantage is that means at times it's possible to lose focus so that neither the core city nor the suburbs nor the rural hinterlands are developed properly. But again, getting back to maybe what was the core of your question is yes, size matters hugely. When you have to deal with 20 million people in a dense space, when you have to deal with that many people, when you have to deal with those levels of challenges just in terms of providing basic services in economies that are, on average, per person, far, far less productive and therefore far less wealthy than the economies of, than the cities in North America or Europe. What is it? In the U.S., there's one city with more than 3.5 million population. Right? That's New York. China, we must have nearly 200 or 150. Right? So it does matter. It does matter. And again, it just changes the order of magnitude of the challenge.
Tricia, I mean, I would add that, there's a debate, isn't there, about what's the natural size of a city? What's the size beyond which you become inefficient, but to which you become efficient? And, of course, the answer is there's no answer. It depends on the economic model that you have and what you need population for. Increasing size, scale, and complexity of a city gives you potentials to house certain functions and to manage them well and to achieve scale within that. But at the end of the day, the natural size of a city is the size for which you're able to provide infrastructure and services that work. So, we haven't yet spoken much about Tokyo in this room, but, Tokyo is still the world's biggest city. And apart from the challenges that Japan has faced over the past 15 years, Tokyo remains a city of incredible quality for its size and scale. Its R&D is superb. Its housing system is challenging but works. Transportation system incredibly efficient. It's polycentric. It's multi-centered structure, basically productive and efficient. So Tokyo, a city of 36 million, is an efficient city, and that's the right size for Tokyo, given the infrastructure platform it's got. But that doesn't mean that every city should try to be the size of Tokyo, because, as Michael says very clearly, it's very difficult in most national contexts to provide an adequate level of infrastructure and services for that density and that complexity. And I think he also makes a very good point that the governance challenges multiply as the city grows bigger. And in particular, if you have a governance system where you elect one leader on one platform, that leader has many challenges in meeting the different needs of the different places, the different communities within them. That's why the conversation about competitiveness of cities also includes a discussion about governance systems, and which governance systems give you the right balance of metropolitan or regional level strategic leadership with a local level of servicing, place management, attention to citizen services. And what's the governance model that gives you the right combination of the two becomes a pretty critical ingredient, because a big city that provides good local services but has no vision of the future doesn't win, and a city that has a big story about its future but no ability to provide local services doesn't win either.
We're getting to sort of having to wrap up this conversation and open the floor out to questions, but I just have maybe one final question for the panelists. Maybe we can just go sort of each of us to talk a little bit about how optimistic are you, or what are the concerns when you think about competitiveness of Asian cities? Just very quickly to wrap everything up. Michael.
It's a rising tide in Asia. Asia is becoming more important. Its cities are becoming more important. More of the cities in the region are understanding globalization. More of them are able to tap into regional and international connectivity. On average, I'm bullish. There are challenges. There are real challenges, certainly. But on average, I think we will see, in 10, 15 years' time, a set of much more successful, much better organized, much better managed, much more efficient cities around Asia than we have today. To me, China, of course, is the big story, and the question in China about cities is whether we'll have 4 or 5 cities that dominate the Chinese economy at the medium and high-end service regimes, or whether we'll have 12 to 15. And that's a multi-billion-dollar question to interested parties.
Sunbei?
I want to just maybe leave you with a pregnant thought, which is there's been a lot of discussions about structural developments of cities and policies. But last night over dinner, I couldn't help but notice this tremendous sense of malaise also existing in Hong Kong regarding cost of living and property prices and so on and so forth. So let me just throw this out to you. One of the things that are very interesting about both Hong Kong and Singapore is they have currencies that are very tied to the US dollar. Hong Kong, because of the linked exchange rate system, although Singapore ostensibly has a more flexible regime of managing the currencies against a basket of currencies of trading nations, the dollar still features very prominently on it. Again, this may be an accident of history, maybe a necessity at a particular part in history, but I cannot help but make a link between the tremendous amount of strain both Hong Kong and Singapore has experienced over the last 5 and 6 years with the exchange rate system they've had in place. You had the global financial crisis that erupted in the fall of 2008. Interest rates had been close to zero in many developing countries, particularly the US, and both Singapore and Hong Kong has followed that virtually 1-for-1, while local conditions would warrant a somewhat higher interest rate. So you've had a prolonged period of negative real interest rates, and of course, that's free money or subsidized money to go invest in properties and so on and so forth. I think that's an issue. That's a relevant issue. That's kind of where some of the more pragmatic macroeconomic policy is going to have a relevance in terms of how the city is going to evolve in terms of their competitiveness, productivity growth, how resources are allocated, whether you go through these huge booms in property cycles, that could be very disruptive. And certainly something that perhaps in the public domain should be discussed. I don't think it's necessarily a sacred cow that nobody is allowed to discuss about.
Tricia, I think there are many reasons to be very optimistic about Asian cities. The rising tide both of urbanization, population growth, industrialization is there. Cities in Europe and North America would give their eye teeth to have national governments like many of the Asian countries have, which understand that urbanization and cities are assets. In Europe and North America, the discourse for a long time has been that cities are drags on the national system. And it's only just been understood that cities are assets. So having that national backing is very important. Clearly, there's investment capital here available. The fiscal systems are not all broke in the way they are elsewhere. And, of course, you've got the lessons from Europe, North America, and elsewhere about how not to urbanize that are very useful to learn, and particularly issues around car dependency and sprawl and all of those things. They're lessons from America, how not to do urbanization. But then I think there are other things that you will have to pay attention to. And, we've said them all, but let's repeat them quickly. Knowledge creation, innovation, enterprise, that nexus of really building your own productive base is going to be very important. Openness to international populations, international talent, and managing diversification and cosmopolitanism is critical. And outside of Singapore and Hong Kong, that's a challenge in most Asian cities. Building identity, character, differentiation, enabling people to really locate these different cities and understand their DNA, and for that to become more visible rather than this kind of same town type thing is going to be key. Recognizing that Asian cities exist in a system with each other, and therefore settling some of these sort of neighborly competitions into a system that's more mature of complementary roles between the cities is going to be very critical. Dealing with the problems of success that we were talking about earlier, the housing challenges, the educational challenges, the skills challenges, the reinvestment, all of that is the agenda for the next 20 or 30 years. But I think, if you look at the assets and the opportunities and you look at the challenges, you'll say on balance a good portion of the Asian cities that are emerging today are going to succeed.
And on that very positive and optimistic note, I'd like to thank our three panelists. This is a very interesting discussion. I'm excited to be in Asia, and I'm very excited to be in Hong Kong. I'm sure we all are. So maybe we can start off questions if anybody has any. If you can put your hand up. The gentleman in the front here, please.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the panel for a very interesting overview. I lived through the periods before and after when the table was turned against Hong Kong in comparison with Singapore. And I can't help feeling that one of the main reasons is because of the political ecology. Of course, there are many factors, but one major change is the change of the political ecology. Now, that touches on governance, but I'm not talking about scale, I'm not talking about currencies, I'm not talking about even the kind of infrastructure, because the political ecology impacts on the ability, the governance that is able to deliver the public goods to boost up the productivity. Now, if you talk about political ecology, my question to the panel is that how are you going to quantify that? I mean, how are you going to incorporate that into the kind of index? And I'm not just talking about Hong Kong, because you can look around the world, in Bangkok, Istanbul. There seems to be a commonality in the disconnect between the governing and the governed. How are you going to address that? Thank you.
Anyone? Maybe Michael, who has done indices?
Well, I don't incorporate such things into my direct measures of competitiveness, but what I do say is, to what extent are these limiting factors? And what are the pros, what are the cons? Singapore historically has had, I've been asked many times, how does a government-directed, economy like Singapore work? And the way I put it is that it may be government-directed, but it's market-oriented, and the market is the market for foreign investment. And that's a very tough market. And so if you look at government programs and policies in Singapore, they're designed in large part to make Singapore a very attractive place in a very, very tough market. In Hong Kong, we have a bit of a government paralysis, but, that's not necessarily a bad thing if you think that an unparalyzed government may not always do the right things. And even though we have a certain amount of paralysis here, we have a situation where eventually we do get the infrastructure done, we do get the business basics right, we do retain our openness, and one can argue that some of the difficulties in our political system also is what ensured that going, from 1996 to 2014 has actually been as smooth as it has been, right? Each system has its warts, each system has its difficulties. But to me, the key thing is, at what point does the political system get in the way of cities, of companies, of individuals making the right decisions? And that can happen in a few directions. It can come through inaction. Government doesn't invest enough in public goods. It can come through action. Government being too interventionist, too directive, trying to control where the economy goes and basically picking the wrong directions. So it's really a matter in each place, what role does government play? Understanding the system. You know, back in 1997, I wrote a piece that, you know, Hong Kong, if you tried to be more directional like Singapore, we would lose some of our entrepreneurship. And if Singapore really tried to be entrepreneurial, they would lose some of their advantages in terms of forward planning. So we really have to understand the systems as they exist, what advantages and disadvantages they create, and then what obstacles need to be overcome.
Can I just add very quickly, Tricia? I mean, the report that we've put out, the 10 Traits of Global Fluency, which is one of the key reports of the Global Cities Initiative, the first trait is leadership with a worldview, right? And that really, picking up on Michael's point, is about understanding what our model is and what our DNA is, understanding global opportunity, threat, niche, chances for specialization, and really connecting a sense of who we are internally with external opportunity. So that's number one. That's like the first base for a globalizing city. And number 9 is government as a global enabler. In other words, that you have frameworks and systems in place, whether it's your immigration rules, your trade rules, your currency system, all of those things, which are designed to enable the city to succeed in the global flow of knowledge, talent, services, products, capital, etc. So what you say, I think, is very important, but in every city that will look different. So it's important to figure out what's going to work for the model that you have and the business that you're in.
Great. The gentleman at the back.
Clay Chandler with the Barron Rock Group, which is a Hong Kong-based consultancy. I'm struck by Greg Clark's comment about the grand bargain that advanced cities like New York and London are trying to strike between the incumbent residents and the newcomers, and to get everyone to work and play together and embrace the openness that enables them to retain their competitiveness. And it struck me because that's such an apt problem for what's happening in Hong Kong right now. I'm just interested that we've kind of managed to go through this whole panel discussion without any discussion of the surprising sort of anti-mainland backlash that we're seeing more and more frequently here in Hong Kong. Michael, as a longtime resident and observer of Hong Kong, I'd be curious to hear your assessment as to how well Hong Kong is managing that balance, and what else it can do to convince people who live here that actually opening up and embracing to the giant neighbor across the border is actually a good thing rather than something that's going to overwhelm them.
And I would add that this is also a critical issue in Singapore as well, where backlash against visiting workers, expats, et cetera, is rising. And, again, I don't actually view the issues in Hong Kong, Singapore as different in kind as one sees in places. I'm originally from New York. I spend a fair amount of time in London and other places. But I think the issue in Hong Kong is that there is, in part, a fear that there are 1.3 billion people north of the boundary, and the notion that Hong Kong can be swamped quite easily in a number of dimensions if there is no control back and forth. And I think there is a frustration. There's a frustration in Hong Kong when we get capital injections from mostly from the Chinese mainland that drive up property prices in Hong Kong, make it less affordable here. So I think these are issues that are natural issues. I think there will be frustrations. I think there are still significant cultural differences between Hong Kong and most of the mainland, certainly not all, and that as the interaction continues, as both sides, as it were, become more knowledgeable, that both sides will be more accommodating and more understanding. But to me, some friction is natural. I mean, you can't open up two places that had been closed off for each other for so long, even with same nation, same ethnicity, and not expect that there would be some friction along the way. So again, my view is there will be friction, and the key thing is to identify the friction, limit the sources to the extent that that's possible. We've got to manage the flows back and forth, but also, a lot of understanding. And in my view, and again, I've been here, as you know, I've been here 17 years. I'm actually surprised how little friction there has been, really, in Hong Kong and actually in Singapore as well, how little tension there has been between the quote-unquote locals and non-locals. But remember, too, it wasn't until around 1990 that more than half of Hong Kong's population had been born in Hong Kong. So a lot of people in Hong Kong, myself included, have to, recognize we haven't been here forever either, right?
Great. We've only got time for one last question. So maybe the gentleman at the back. That one there, yeah.
Thank you very much. Alejandro Reyes from the University of Hong Kong. I'm wondering if someone on the panel, perhaps Michael or Greg, might talk about the rural issue, because I'm focusing on cities, but I mean, this may not matter in Hong Kong and Singapore where we don't have an agricultural sector, but the rural-urban dynamic and how to manage it is very important. And in terms of competitiveness of an economy, we also have to look at rural productivity, the productivity of the agricultural sector. So I think one of the particularly important challenges in politics is, well, how does a government manage its rural sector in terms of trying to cater to the growing urban population, but yet trying to help develop and maintain the productivity of your agricultural sector. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that. Thank you.
I'll make a quick comment and say, remember, the process of urbanization is not just a process of managing cities. It's about managing the places that people are leaving. And in particular, the approach that needs to be taken is one of consciously managing how cities grow and how they develop, their integration with the rural hinterland and their interaction with it and how that's serviced, and using the cities as an asset for the rural areas. And then also for the vast areas that don't have cities in them, there needs to be an equally conscious territorial management system for those. So take a country, I mean, the country I visit a lot at the moment is Ethiopia. Ethiopia has a reputation, because of all of the challenges it's been through, of being a very, very severely challenged country. But if you look at the way the Ethiopian government today is consciously restructuring the rural areas to account for the growth in Ethiopian cities, and has, capital city like Addis Ababa forming a very strong alliance with the rural areas around it, with so many people who both live in the city and live in the countryside at different times of the week, the month, or the year, depending upon the season. There's a very conscious attempt to build the urban and the rural together, and to exploit those synergies and to support rural areas to adjust to urbanization. The other slightly flippant point, but very sincere, is that feeding the city is now the critical challenge facing almost every country. And most countries in the world, or most cities in the world, have a food supply system where they can only feed the population they've got over a course of about 2 to 3 days at most, without further supplies coming in from rural areas. So the whole issue of food security, the food system, how that works in an urbanized world is going to be critical. And I think it won't be too long before everybody starts to pay attention to rural and agricultural areas again, realizing that the success of the city depends upon the success of the rural areas.
Great. I hope that answered your question. And I think we're pretty much out of time. So thank you very much, Greg, Sunbei, and Michael, for a great discussion around cities, competitiveness of cities. And it's an exciting time to be in Asia. And thank you again for being such a lovely audience.